Yuna disarmed the intruder in 4 seconds, breaking his wrist before he'd finished raising the blade. Kwon Jae-min didn't move from the doorway, his own gun still holstered, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Do that again," he said quietly. "The wrist lock. Where were you taught that?" "Does it matter?" He's still breathing. "It matters," Jae-min said, "because only one program in this country ever taught that exact technique, and it was shut down 11 years before you were born." Yuna kept her face perfectly still, the way she'd been trained to. "Then someone's records are wrong." "No," he said, crossing the room slowly. "I think someone erased the right ones, and I think my father knew exactly who you are before he ever hired you to protect me." Welcome to the Mandy Story Room. If you enjoy stories like this one, filled with mystery, tension, and characters who earn every twist, subscribing to this channel costs you nothing, but it means a great deal to us, and it's the single best way to make sure more stories like this one keep getting made. Thank you for being here. Now, let's continue. The intruder was still on the floor, cradling his broken wrist against his chest, his face a pale mixture of pain and confusion. 2 of Jae-min's security staff arrived a moment later, pulling the man carefully upright, restraining him properly, murmuring low questions in clipped Korean about who had sent him and how exactly he'd gotten past the outer gate undetected. Yuna stepped back from the scene, letting them work, her attention still fixed on Jae-min's face. She had disarmed men before. She had ended fights in less time than it took most people to decide whether they were actually in danger. What she hadn't expected, on her 3rd night in this house, was for the client she'd been hired to protect to look at the exact mechanics of how she'd done it, instead of simply being grateful she had. "You're not asking the question everyone else would ask," she said. "Which question is that? Whether I'm hurt, whether he had backup, whether the house is secure." She nodded toward the restrained intruder. "You're asking where I learned to break a man's wrist in under a second. That's an unusual priority for someone who just watched an armed stranger get inside his home." Jae-min's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in the careful composure he'd maintained since walking in. "I have unusual priorities," he said. "You'll get used to them." He crossed the room to examine the point of entry, a service window near the kitchen that should have registered on 3 separate sensors before anyone reached it. He crouched, running a finger along the frame, his expression calculating rather than alarmed. "This wasn't opportunistic," he said. "Someone disabled the sensor sequence in a very specific order, the kind of order only someone with detailed knowledge of this house's security architecture would know. That's not a burglar. That's someone testing us." "Testing you for what?" Yuna asked. "I don't know yet." He straightened, glancing toward her with an expression that seemed to weigh her differently than it had a few minutes earlier. "But I intend to find out, starting with exactly how a woman my father's agency assigned 3 days ago happened to be standing in the one hallway that mattered when it happened." "That's not an accusation I appreciate," Yuna said evenly. "It's not an accusation," Jae-min said. "It's an observation. I've learned to pay attention to convenient timing in this business. You'll forgive me if tonight qualifies." He didn't explain further that night. He supervised the intruder's removal personally, made 2 phone calls she wasn't invited to overhear, and disappeared into his study without another word to her, leaving Yuna standing in the hallway with more questions than she'd walked in with 3 days earlier, when the agency had assigned her this contract with unusual speed and unusually generous pay. She retreated to the small guest suite she'd been given near the east wing, sat on the edge of the bed, and reviewed the encounter in her mind with the same discipline teacher Beck had drilled into her more than 15 years ago. Every detail mattered. Every reaction that didn't match the obvious explanation was a thread worth pulling. Jae-min hadn't been afraid of the intruder. He'd been afraid of her. Or more precisely, she corrected herself, he'd been afraid of what her technique meant, which was an entirely different thing, and considerably more interesting. Kwon Il-sung received the report from his son at 11 that night, sitting behind the heavy desk in his private study, a room Yuna had not yet been permitted to enter. Jae-min stood across from him, still faintly unsettled by the evening's events, watching his father's face for the reassurance he expected and didn't receive. "An intruder got past outer security," Jae-min said. "The new bodyguard handled it without a scratch. Efficient, professional. I thought you'd want to know the placement was a good decision." Il-sung's expression didn't shift, but something in the room's temperature seemed to drop regardless. "How did she handle it?" he asked, his voice carefully even. "Specifically." "A wrist lock. Broke his arm before he could bring the blade up. Clean, controlled, no wasted motion." Jae-min studied his father's face, noticing the stillness settling over him. "Why does that matter?" Il-sung was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk in front of him, knuckles pale against the dark wood. "Run a background check on her," he said finally. "A private one, not through the agency. Through Detective Song, the way we used to handle sensitive matters before you took over the daily business. She already passed the agency's vetting, full clearance, verified references, 3 years of contract work with an excellent record." "I don't care what the agency verified," Il-sung said, his voice sharpening for the first time. "I want to know who trained her, and I want to know before she's alone in this house with you again." Jae-min frowned, the request landing strangely against everything he understood about his father's usual caution. "You're not making sense. She saved us from an intruder tonight. You're treating her like the threat. There are things about this family's history you don't understand," Il-sung said, his eyes fixed on some point past his son's shoulder, somewhere in the middle distance of a memory Jae-min couldn't see. "Things I've spent 30 years making sure stayed buried, for good reason. A skill like the one you just described doesn't simply appear in a young woman by accident. Someone trained her deliberately, in a technique that's specific, and I want to know who, before I decide whether her presence in this house is protection or exposure." "Exposure to what?" Il-sung's expression closed like a door. "Do as I ask," he said, and something in his tone ended the conversation the way it always did when he wanted a subject closed rather than discussed. Quietly. "Tonight." Jae-min hesitated at the door. "If this is about protecting me from something," he said, "you should know I'd rather hear it directly than piece it together from your reactions." "That's not the same thing at all," Il-sung said, though the argument seemed to cost him something to make, his usual certainty noticeably absent. "Wait until Detective Song finishes his review. Give me that much time before you decide her account of things is the correct one." "How much time?" Jae-min asked. "A week," Il-sung said. "Perhaps less." Jae-min left the study unconvinced, the particular frustration of a son who had spent his entire life deferring to a father's judgment now colliding, for the first time, with a growing certainty that deference itself might be exactly what had kept this family blind to its own history for 3 decades. Jae-min left the study troubled in a way he couldn't fully name, the particular unease of watching his father react to good news, as though it were a warning. 15 years earlier, in a training compound tucked into the hills outside a small town in Gyeongju province, a 12-year-old Yuna had knelt in a dirt courtyard, watching an older woman demonstrate a wrist lock on a padded training dummy with unhurried precision. "This technique controls," Teacher Beck had said, her voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard of a dozen children who had all arrived here through some version of the same story. No parents, no family willing or able to keep them, nowhere else that wanted them. "It does not kill. It does not maim beyond repair. You will learn many things in this place that could end a person's life in seconds. This is not one of them, and I want you to understand why that matters before I teach you anything else." "Why does it matter?" young Yuna had asked, the bluntness of a child who hadn't yet learned when questions were welcome and when they weren't. Baek had studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because control is a choice," she said. "Killing rarely requires one. I would rather raise children capable of choosing restraint than children who never learned there was a choice to make at all." It had taken Yuna years to fully understand what her teacher meant by that, and longer still to wonder why a program built around restraint had been shut down so completely that no public record of its existence remained anywhere she'd ever been able to find. There had been one other rule, delivered only once, early in her training, that she'd never fully understood, and had never once needed to break, until now. "If your work ever brings you near a shipping family from Gyeongju province," Beck had told her. Not long after that first lesson, her voice carrying a weight Yuna hadn't recognized as fear at the time. "You come to me before you accept the contract, not after." Before, Yuna had asked why. Beck had not answered. Instead, she'd changed the subject to footwork, correcting the angle of Yuna's stance with a firm hand on her shoulder, the way she always did when a conversation had wandered somewhere she didn't intend to follow. It had been, Yuna realized only now, one of exactly 3 moments in 15 years of training when Baek had refused to answer a direct question outright, rather than simply redirecting it with a lesson. The other 2 had involved the reason the original program closed, and the reason Baek herself had never taken another student after Yuna's cohort graduated. At the time, a 12-year-old absorbed in the discipline of learning to move her own body with precision hadn't thought to weigh the significance of that silence. Sitting now in an unfamiliar guest room decades later, she found herself cataloging it alongside everything else that suddenly seemed less like the ordinary reticence of a private woman, and more like the careful architecture of someone protecting a specific, dangerous secret. Back in the present, Yuna sat awake long after the house had gone quiet, turning that old, unexplained instruction over in her mind for the first time in years. She had taken this contract 3 days ago, quickly, through the agency's usual channels, without ever thinking to check whether the Kwon family's shipping business connected to that decade-old warning. She hadn't told Beck. There hadn't been time, and if she was honest with herself, some part of her hadn't wanted to give her mentor the chance to say no to a contract this well-paid, this professionally significant. Now, sitting in an unfamiliar guest room in a house whose patriarch had apparently reacted to her competence with something closer to dread than gratitude, she found herself wishing she'd made that call before accepting the assignment rather than after. She reached for her phone, hesitated, and set it back down without dialing. Whatever this was, she wanted more information before she brought it to Beck. She had spent 15 years learning to gather facts before drawing conclusions. She wasn't going to abandon that discipline now, not when her own history had just become the subject under investigation. She thought too of something Beck had told her years ago, during the final months of her training, when the older students were being prepared for independent contract work for the first time. Beck had gathered them one evening, unusually formal, and told them that the discipline they'd learned was meant to protect people, never to be used carelessly, and that if any of them ever found themselves working for someone whose history troubled them, they had a responsibility to walk away, rather than complete the contract regardless of payment. At the time, it had seemed like ordinary professional ethics, the kind of speech any careful mentor might give. Now, weighing it against tonight's events, it felt considerably more specific, as though Beck had been preparing her, even then, for exactly this kind of situation without ever naming why. The next morning, Yuna requested access to the household's local archive room, a modest collection of family records, business documents, and historical materials Il-sung had maintained for decades, ostensibly for the family's own reference. The request was denied within the hour, politely but firmly, by a household assistant who cited security protocols Yuna hadn't encountered in any other contract she'd worked. She found Jae-min in the estate's smaller dining room shortly after, reviewing shipping manifests over a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold some time ago. "Your father's staff denied my request to review the family archive," she said, sitting across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Standard security protocol for a bodyguard would be full access to anywhere I might need to defend. Selective denial like that usually means someone's hiding something specific, not protecting something general." Jae-min set down the manifest he'd been reading, studying her with the same careful attention he'd shown the previous night. "You're direct. I'm efficient. There's a difference, though people often confuse the two." She held his gaze. "Your father ordered a background check on me last night. I heard 2 of your staff discussing it this morning, not quietly enough. I'd like to know why a man whose life I potentially saved 12 hours ago is more interested in investigating me than thanking me." Something shifted behind Jae-min's expression, a flicker of the same unease that had settled over him in his father's study the previous night. "I don't know," he admitted, quieter now. "He's never explained himself to me about anything connected to the early years of this business. I used to think it was simply privacy. Watching him last night, I'm no longer certain that's the right word for it." "What word would you use instead?" Jae-min was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "Fear," he said finally. "Though I've never once seen my father afraid of anything in my entire life, until he heard how you broke that man's wrist." He set the cup down and looked at her more directly than he had in either of their previous conversations. "Can I ask you something personal? You don't have to answer. You can ask. Where did you grow up, before your training?" My father's reaction last night felt personal, not professional, the way a man reacts to a memory, rather than a threat assessment. "I keep wondering if there's a version of your history that connects to something in his." Yuna considered how much to share, weighing professional caution against the growing certainty that withholding information wasn't serving her half as well as it usually did. "State care, until I was 12, she said. "Then a private training program in Gyeongju province, run by a woman I've spent half my life calling teacher. I don't know who funded it. I never had reason to ask, until last night gave me one." Jae-min went very still. "Gyeongju," he repeated. "That's where my father's business began. Before the shipping contracts, before any of the wealth you'd recognize now. He started with almost nothing in that province, and he's never once told me the details of how he built what came after." "That's not proof of anything," Yuna said, though something cold and unwelcome had settled into her own chest at the sheer coincidence of it. Provinces are large, programs are common enough. No, Jae-min said slowly, thinking it through. But it's not nothing either. 3 days later, having exhausted the obvious channels within the household, Yuna traveled into Gyeongju itself, seeking out a name she remembered from a passing mention during her training years earlier, a historian and archivist named Han Se-yeon, who specialized in the region's less official records, the kind of local history that rarely made it into any government database. Han's office occupied a narrow converted hanok near the old city center, shelves stacked floor to ceiling with local records, newspaper archives, and boxes of undigitized material collected over decades. She looked up when Yuna entered, appraising her with the particular sharpness of someone accustomed to visitors who wanted things they weren't supposed to have. "You're not the usual kind of researcher," Han said. "Most people who come looking for old records want land deeds or family genealogies. You have the look of someone searching for something that isn't supposed to exist anymore." "I'm looking for a youth training program," Yuna said. "It would have operated in this province roughly 25 years ago, possibly connected to a shipping family's early business dealings. I don't have a name for it. I only have the fact that it existed, and that whoever ran it wanted it thoroughly erased." Han's expression sharpened with interest rather than caution. "Erased records are my specialty," she said. "Give me a few days. Sometimes what's missing tells you almost as much as what remains, if you know how to read the gaps." "How does someone erase a program that thoroughly?" Yuna asked. "I've searched official channels myself. There's nothing. Not a name, not a location, not a single administrator on record." Han leaned back in her chair, considering the question with the particular patience of someone who'd spent a career untangling exactly this kind of deliberate silence. "In my experience, there are only 2 ways to erase something that completely," she said. "Either the people responsible had enough money and influence to have every official record quietly removed, which happens more often than most people realize in provinces like this one, or the program itself was never properly documented to begin with, existing entirely outside any system that would have required registration or oversight in the first place." "Which do you think this was?" "Given the fragment I already suspect exists," Han said, "I'd guess both. Something started informally, off the books, and then someone with resources made certain it stayed that way permanently once it became inconvenient to remember." While Yuna pursued the archive, Jae-min conducted his own quiet investigation, motivated by an unease he could no longer dismiss as simple deference to his father's privacy. He began with the household's oldest staff members, the ones who had worked for his father since before Jae-min's own birth, asking careful, indirect questions about the early years of the family's shipping business. Most gave him nothing useful, either genuinely uninformed or carefully trained, over decades, not to remember certain things aloud. But one groundskeeper, an elderly man named Mr. Choi, who had worked the estate grounds for over 40 years, paused at a question about the property's original buildings, his weathered face going carefully blank in a way that told Jae-min more than any direct answer could have. "There used to be a training facility on the eastern edge of the property," Mr. Choi said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. "Before you were born. It was torn down the same year you arrived. I always assumed the timing was coincidence." "Was it?" Jae-min asked. Mr. Choi studied him for a long moment, the particular hesitation of a man deciding how much loyalty he owed to a question versus to the family that had employed him for 4 decades. "I couldn't say, young master," he said finally, and returned to his work, offering nothing further despite Jae-min's continued questions. Jae-min stood in the garden for a while after the old man had gone back to his pruning, staring at the eastern edge of the property where nothing now remained but an ordinary stretch of manicured lawn, giving no indication it had ever held anything at all. He tried to imagine what kind of structure had once stood there, what kind of program his father had funded, and then dismantled so thoroughly the same year his own son was born, as though the timing itself had been a kind of closing of one chapter to make room for another. He thought of every guarded silence he'd absorbed without question over the years. Every time his father had changed the subject when the conversation drifted too close to the family's early history, every framed photograph in the house that began conspicuously with Jae-min's own childhood, rather than anything before it. He had always assumed those gaps were simply the ordinary privacy of a man who preferred to look forward rather than back. Standing in the garden now, he understood, with a discomfort he couldn't quite name, that assumption might have protected him from a truth he'd never actually been given the chance to reject. 6 days after the intruder's failed attempt, Han Se-yeon summoned Yuna back to her office, a single folder waiting on the desk between them, considerably thinner than Yuna had hoped for after nearly a week of searching. I found one reference, Han said. Buried in a redacted local business registry from 26 years ago, a joint initiative described only as a youth development program, funded partly through early shipping revenues connected to your employer's family. No further description survives in any record I could locate. Whoever handled the paperwork afterward was thorough. This is the only surviving trace. Yuna studied the single page, a fragment of bureaucratic language that told her almost nothing beyond confirming what she'd already begun to suspect. That's not much to build a mystery around, she said. No, Han agreed. But it confirms the program existed, that it had direct financial ties to the Kwon family specifically, and that someone made a considerable effort to ensure nothing else about it survived anywhere official. In my experience, people don't spend that kind of effort erasing something harmless. Yuna thanked her, took the folder, and left the archive with more questions than answers, though for the first time since arriving at the estate, she had actual confirmation that her instincts about Il-sung's reaction hadn't been paranoia. Something real connected her training to this family, buried deep enough that even a dedicated local historian could find only a single surviving fragment of it. She thought of Beck's old, unexplained warning, and felt, for the first time, something closer to dread than curiosity. That evening, back at the estate, Yuna found Jae-min waiting in the small dining room again, a different kind of tension in his posture than she'd seen from him before. My father caught me questioning the groundskeeper, he said without preamble. He wasn't angry. He was frightened, in a way I've genuinely never witnessed from him before. He told me, very carefully, that some questions are better left unasked, for my own safety as much as anyone else's. That's not the reaction of a man protecting privacy, Yuna said. That's the reaction of a man protecting a secret dangerous enough to hurt the people who go looking for it. I know, Jae-min said quietly. I've spent my entire life assuming my father's silences were about dignity, or grief, or simply not wanting to relive difficult years. Watching his face when I asked Mr. Choi about the old training facility, I don't think that's what any of this has ever actually been about. Yuna set Han's thin folder on the table between them, sliding it toward him. There was a program, she said, connected to your family's early shipping revenue, deliberately erased from every record except one surviving fragment. I believe it's connected to my own training, though I don't yet understand how or why. Jae-min opened the folder, reading the single page carefully, his expression darkening with each line. You think my father funded whatever trained you? I think your father funded something, Yuna said, and that whatever it was frightened him badly enough, 26 years later, to react the way he did the moment he heard how I disarmed that intruder. I don't yet know if those two things are the same program, but I intend to find out, with or without his permission. Jae-min studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that hadn't been there in their earlier conversations. Not suspicion this time, but the particular recognition of someone realizing an ally had arrived exactly when he needed one, even if neither of them had planned it that way. Then we're doing this together, he said. Whatever this is, I'm not asking you to work around my father's silence alone anymore. If something dangerous is buried in this family's history, I'd rather know it standing beside the person capable of breaking a man's wrist in under a second than sitting in my study waiting for my father to finally decide I deserve the truth. That's not the safest decision, Yuna said. No, Jae-min agreed, but it's the honest one, and I'm tired of settling for the other kind. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, stopping just short of it, as though some part of him understood the gesture would mean more than either of them was ready for yet. For what it's worth, he added, I don't think you were sent here to hurt this family. Whatever my father believes, whatever your own history turns out to involve, 3 days of watching you work has told me more about your character than any background check ever could. You barely know me. I know you told the truth about the security sensor being disabled deliberately, when it would have been easier to simply accept credit for a lucky catch, Jae-min said. I know you asked for archive access honestly, instead of trying to find another way around my father's staff, when a less scrupulous person might have simply forced the issue or gone around him entirely. I know you came to me with Han's findings today instead of pursuing this entirely on your own, when you had no obligation to include me in any of it. He held her gaze. Those are choices, not accidents. I've learned over the years to trust the pattern of a person's actual choices more than anything else I could possibly know about them. Yuna didn't answer immediately, something in his certainty landing more deeply than she'd expected it to, an unfamiliar warmth threading through the careful discipline she usually maintained around clients. Her phone buzzed against the table before either of them could say anything else. an unfamiliar number lighting the screen, a single message waiting when she opened it. You broke his wrist beautifully. Teacher Baek would be proud, though I imagine she hasn't told you why the lesson mattered as much as it did. Ask her about the Gyeongju initiative. Ask her what she and I built together, before she decided restraint was worth more than justice. She already knows exactly why you were sent to that house. The only question left is whether she'll finally tell you the truth herself, or whether I will. Yuna stared at the screen, the careful, deliberate phrasing settling into her chest like ice water. Whoever had sent this knew her training history in specific, intimate detail. They knew Baek's name. They knew, with absolute certainty, that Yuna's placement in this household hadn't been a coincidence of agency assignment at all. What is it? Jae-min asked, watching her face change. Yuna turned the phone toward him slowly, her hand steadier than she felt. I think, she said quietly, we were both right to be afraid of the same silence. I just didn't realize, until this exact moment, that the silence includes my own teacher. Jae-min read the message a second time, then a third, his expression darkening with each pass. Whoever sent this knows details about your training a stranger shouldn't have access to, he said. That's not a guess or a threat pulled from a background check. That's someone who was actually there. Someone who worked with Baek, Yuna said slowly, the shape of it settling into place even as she said it aloud. Not against her, with her, before whatever happened between them that made one of them decide restraint mattered more than the other one was willing to accept. You think there were two of them running whatever this program actually was? I think, Yuna said, closing her hand around the phone, that the only person who can answer that with any certainty is the one person I've trusted completely for 15 years, and I am no longer entirely sure that trust was ever fully earned. Outside the dining room's tall windows, the estate grounds had gone dark and quiet. The eastern edge of the property where an erased training facility had once stood now nothing more than an ordinary stretch of shadowed lawn. Yuna stared toward it for a long moment, aware for the first time that whatever answers waited for her wouldn't come from this house at all. They would come from Baek, whether her teacher was ready to give them or not. Yuna didn't sleep that night. She sat with the message open on her phone until the words stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like an invitation she hadn't yet decided whether to accept, turning over every possible version of what Gyeongju initiative might actually mean and what it would cost her to finally ask the one person who could answer with certainty. She called Baek at dawn. Her teacher answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular alertness of someone who had been awake for hours already, or perhaps someone who had been waiting for this exact call for far longer than one night. You received a message, Baek said, before Yuna could speak. Not a question. You knew someone would contact me. I hoped they wouldn't, Baek said. I should have known better than to hope for anything where he's concerned. Who is he? Yuna asked. Not the instructor's title, his name. Something real, after 15 years of you telling me almost nothing about the years before I came into your care. Baek was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Not over the phone, she said finally. Come to me. Tonight, if you can manage it. Some things deserve to be said face to face, especially after this long. I have a contract to protect, Yuna said. I can't simply leave the estate unguarded. Then bring whoever you need to bring, Baek said, something tired entering her voice. I think, given everything that's about to unfold, it's past time the people you're protecting understood exactly what they're protecting themselves from as well. Han Se-yeon called an hour later with the second piece of the puzzle, her voice carrying an edge of genuine unease that hadn't been present during their first meeting. I found something, she said. Not another document, a person. A retired provincial administrator, in his 80s now, who processed some of the original paperwork before it was sealed. He's willing to talk, on the condition that his name never appears anywhere connected to this conversation. Yuna met him that same afternoon in a quiet tea house on the edge of the old city, an elderly man with careful, deliberate speech who studied her for a long moment before he began. 26 years ago, he said, 2 young men came to my office with an unusual proposal, a private youth initiative they called it, training orphaned children in disciplines useful to private security work, funded jointly, with the promise of stable employment for the children once they came of age. On paper it sounded almost admirable. 2 men, Yuna said carefully, not one. Business partners, the old man said. Kwon Il-sung, building his shipping fortune from almost nothing at the time, and a man everyone called simply the instructor, though I never learned his given name in all the paperwork I processed. He ran the training itself. Kwon provided the funding and the property. Something cold settled into Yuna's chest. What happened to end it? The old man was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea he hadn't touched. I only know what I was told afterward, when they came to me demanding every record be destroyed. There was an incident, a live operation, not training, involving several of the older students, ordered without full authorization from everyone who should have approved it. Something went catastrophically wrong. I was never told exactly how many children were hurt. I was told enough to understand it was more than the two men involved could bear to have made public. Do you remember any names? Yuna asked. Anyone connected to the families involved? Anyone who might still be alive to tell their side of it? The old man hesitated, glancing around the quiet tea house as though old habits of caution hadn't fully faded even now. There was a woman, he said finally, a caseworker who placed several of the children in that program originally, before anyone understood what it would eventually become. She kept her own private records, separate from anything official, because she never fully trusted the arrangement even in the early years. I don't know if she's still alive. I don't know if those records still exist. But if you found her, she might tell you considerably more than I'm able to. Do you have a name? Only a surname, the old man said. Joe. She would be well into her 80s by now, if she's living at all. Yuna thanked him, left considerably more unsettled than when she'd arrived, and spent the remainder of the afternoon with Han attempting to trace whatever remained of a woman named Cho, who might have kept the only honest record of what had actually happened 26 years ago. Later that night, in a small training hall on the outskirts of the city that Baek had maintained quietly for years, separate from any address Yuna had known to associate with her teacher, the two of them finally sat across from each other, the distance between them heavier than it had ever been in 15 years. Tell me everything, Yuna said. Not the careful version, not the version designed to protect me from something you've decided I can't handle. I've spent the last week learning enough on my own to know the shape of it. I need you to fill in what I don't yet understand. Baek was quiet for a long moment, studying her former student with an expression Yuna had rarely seen on her face, not the calm authority of a teacher, but something closer to exhaustion carried far too long. 26 years ago, Baek said finally, I was younger than you are now, and considerably more certain that discipline alone could fix any wound a child carried into my care. I partnered with a man who shared my skill but not my values, though I didn't understand that difference until it nearly cost several children their lives. The instructor, Yuna said, the man who's been sending me messages. Baek nodded slowly. We built the program together. Kwon Il-sung funded it, more interested in loyal, capable protection for his growing business than in the philosophy of how we shaped the children under our care. For the first several years, it worked exactly as intended. We trained orphans no one else wanted, gave them purpose, skill, a future considerably better than the one waiting for them otherwise. What changed? He changed, Baek said. Or perhaps he was always this way, and I simply refused to see it until the evidence became impossible to ignore. He believed restraint was a weakness we were teaching out of sentiment rather than necessity. He believed the children were ready for real operations years before I did, and eventually, without my knowledge or approval, he sent 4 of our oldest students on a live enforcement mission against a rival business interest threatening Kwon's early shipping contracts. Yuna felt something go very still in her chest. What happened to them? 2 survived, Baek said, her voice carefully controlled. 1 was left permanently unable to walk. 1 did not survive the operation at all. She held Yuna's gaze, unflinching despite the weight of what she was saying. He was 12 years old. The number landed like a physical blow. Yuna had been exactly that age when she'd first knelt in Baek's training courtyard, learning the same wrist lock that had, decades earlier, been taught to a child who never had the chance to grow past that age at all. After that, Baek continued, I ended the program entirely. I told Kwon I would take full responsibility for whatever remained of our reputation if he ever let a single detail of what had happened become public, and in exchange, he would fund the complete erasure of every record connecting either of us to the initiative. He agreed immediately. I think in his own way, he was as horrified as I was, though horror alone didn't stop him from choosing silence over accountability. And the instructor. He disagreed with my decision to close the program entirely, Baek said. He believed the death was a tragedy, but not a reason to abandon what we'd built. We separated permanently that same year. I took the surviving students who wanted to continue training, rebuilt the entire curriculum around restraint rather than lethality, and made certain, every year since, that no student of mine would ever again be sent into an operation they weren't fully prepared to survive. What happened to the students who stayed with him instead? Something flickered across Bak's face, old grief resurfacing with visible effort. 3 of them chose to remain under his training rather than mine, she said. I lost contact with all 3 within a handful of years. I've spent considerable effort, over the decades since, trying to learn what became of them, with very little success. I fear, given what I know of the path he chose, that their training served purposes considerably less restrained than anything I would have permitted. You never tried to stop him. I tried, in the early years, Bake said. He was careful never to operate anywhere I could easily trace him, and I made the difficult decision, eventually, to focus what resources I had on protecting the students who remained in my care, rather than chasing a man determined to stay hidden. I've regretted that choice more times than I can count, particularly now, watching him resurface exactly where I always feared he eventually would. You never told me any of this. I told myself I was protecting you from a history that had nothing to do with who you'd become, Bake said. I see now that I was protecting myself from having to explain exactly how much I failed the children who came before you. She paused, something raw entering her voice for the first time. When the agency offered your name for a contract protecting Kwon Il-sung's son, I nearly refused it outright. Instead, I told myself it was an opportunity. If the instructor ever resurfaced, ever came looking for the reckoning I always feared he wanted, I would rather you be standing exactly where you were needed most, capable of protecting the family, than somewhere else entirely unprepared for what might come. You used me, Yuna said quietly, without telling me any of the reasons why. I did, Bake admitted, no defense offered, no softening of the admission. It was wrong of me, and I am sorry for it, though I understand that isn't enough to undo the decision. The next morning, Jae-min found his father waiting for him in the study before he'd even finished his coffee, an expression on Il-sung's face that Jae-min hadn't seen since the night of the intruder. Detective Song's review confirmed enough, Il-sung said, without preamble. I assume you've already learned considerably more than his report ever could have told you. I know about the initiative, Jae-min said. I know you funded it. I don't yet know everything else. Il-sung sat down heavily behind his desk, looking, for the first time in Jae-min's memory, genuinely old. Sit, he said. You deserve the truth directly from me, rather than pieced together from a bodyguard's investigation and an old man's half-buried guilt. He told his son everything then, the partnership, the funding, the decision he'd made to trust his business partner's judgment about the children's readiness rather than questioning it, the operation he'd approved without fully understanding what it would actually require of them, and the boy who never came home from it. I remember the exact morning I gave my approval, Il-sung said, his voice distant, pulled back into a memory he'd clearly spent decades trying not to revisit. The instructor came to me with a proposal for a live operation, framed entirely as a controlled, low-risk assignment. Guard a shipment, nothing more. I asked whether the students were ready. He assured me they were, and I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, because doubting him would have meant slowing down a business I was desperate to grow as quickly as possible. You didn't ask Teacher Beck. She would have refused, Il-sung said. I knew that even then, though I told myself at the time it was simply because she was overly cautious, rather than because she understood something about those children that I had never bothered to learn myself. He pressed both hands flat against the desk, steadying himself. I found out what happened the following morning, when the instructor arrived at my office with 2 injured children and news of a 3rd who hadn't survived. I have relived that morning more times than I could ever count in 26 years, and I have never once found a version of it where my own responsibility feels smaller than it actually was. I told myself for 26 years that I bore only secondary responsibility, Il-sung continued, that the instructor made the operational decisions, that I simply provided funding and property, that the death, however tragic, wasn't directly my doing. He looked up at his son, something breaking open in his composed expression. I have come to understand, slowly, painfully, over the years since, that funding a system you don't fully oversee is its own kind of responsibility. I built something I didn't understand well enough to control, and a child paid for that failure with his life. Jae-min sat in silence for a long moment, the entire architecture of his childhood rearranging itself around this new, devastating context. Why did you never tell me any of this? Because I was ashamed, Il-sung said simply. And because I told myself that keeping you ignorant of it was protecting you, when really it was only ever protecting myself from having to see the disappointment in your eyes that I'm seeing right now. That afternoon, Yuna returned to the estate to find Jae-min waiting for her in the garden, near the eastern edge of the property where an erased training facility had once stood. My father told me everything, he said, before she could speak. The initiative, the operation that went wrong, the boy who died. He looked toward the empty stretch of lawn, his expression heavy with a grief that belonged, in some complicated way, to a tragedy that had happened before he was even born. I keep thinking about how many years I spent assuming my father's silences were about dignity. They were about this, all of it, this entire time. How is he? Yuna asked. Devastated, Jae-min said, genuinely, for the first time I've ever witnessed. I think some part of him has been waiting 26 years for someone to finally force the truth into the open, even if he never had the courage to do it himself. Yuna nodded, understanding the particular relief and devastation of finally naming a wound that had been left to fester in silence for far too long. There's more, she said. Baek told me everything last night. The instructor who's been sending me messages, he was her partner in the original program. He disagreed with her decision to end it after the death. They separated permanently, and he's apparently spent 26 years believing accountability never actually came for either of them. You think he wants revenge? I think, Yuna said carefully, he wants something considerably more complicated than revenge. Baek atoned by changing everything about how she trained her students afterward. I don't think he ever believed atonement was necessary at all. I think he spent decades believing the only mistake anyone made was stopping before the mission was finished. The message arrived that evening, precise as always, addressed once more to Yuna directly. You've learned enough by now to understand why I've been patient. Meet me tonight, alone, at the old training grounds. Bring no one. I have no interest in hurting you. You were always the most promising student to come out of everything we built, even if Baek never told you that directly. I only want to finally have the conversation Kwon Il-sung has spent 26 years avoiding. Yuna showed the message to Jae-min, who read it twice before looking up at her with an expression caught somewhere between fear and determination. You're not going alone, he said. He specified alone. He also orchestrated a break-in designed to force your hand and reveal exactly what you're capable of, Jae-min said. I don't think following his instructions to the letter is the safest choice available to us right now. It's the choice most likely to keep everyone else safe, Yuna said. If he wanted your father dead, or you, he's had ample opportunity already. Whatever this is, I believe him when he says he wants a conversation first. I'd rather have that conversation on my own terms than force a confrontation none of us are prepared for. Jae-min studied her for a long moment, clearly unhappy with the decision but recognizing, finally, the particular authority she carried in exactly this kind of situation. Then I'll be close enough to reach you the moment you need me, he said, whether he specified alone or not. The eastern edge of the property, empty for 26 years, felt considerably colder that night than the rest of the estate grounds, the darkness pooling thick beneath trees that had grown up around whatever structure once stood there. Yuna arrived exactly on time, unarmed at the instructor's insistence, though she'd never once in her career walked into a meeting without some form of contingency, and tonight was no exception. He was waiting for her already, a tall man in his 60s with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated by people who mistook age for diminished capability. He studied her with an expression of genuine, unguarded interest, entirely unlike the calculated menace she'd expected. You look exactly like I imagined you would, he said. Baek always did have an eye for potential. You're the reason a 12-year-old died, Yuna said, no preamble, no softening. I've spent the last 2 days learning exactly what you did, and I don't have any interest in pretending this is a friendly conversation between old colleagues. Something flickered across his expression, not offense, but a kind of tired recognition. I've carried that boy's death for 26 years, he said, longer than you've been alive. I don't need you to remind me of the cost. I've never once forgotten it. Then why did you keep training the others afterward, year after year, Yuna asked. Why not stop entirely, the way Baek did, if the weight of it actually mattered to you the way you're claiming it does now? Because stopping felt like admitting the entire premise was wrong, he said, something almost like honesty entering his voice for the first time. That children like us, discarded, unwanted, could only ever be victims or liabilities, never anything capable of real strength. Baek chose restraint. I chose to keep building capability, and told myself, for years, that capability alone would eventually justify the cost. I am no longer entirely certain I believe that anymore, though it has taken considerably longer than it should have for me to admit it aloud. Then why are you here? Why now, after 26 years of silence? Because Kwon Il-sung has spent every one of those years living comfortably with his fortune, his son, his careful reputation, while the families of the children we hurt receive nothing, the instructor said. No acknowledgement, no compensation, no accountability whatsoever, beyond a sealed record that made certain no one would ever ask him to account for any of it. I disagreed with Paek about many things, but I've never disagreed that the man who funded our failure has spent far too long escaping the consequences of it. Yuna studied him carefully, searching for the deception she'd expected to find, and finding, instead, something considerably more complicated. A man whose grievance, however violently he'd chosen to pursue it, wasn't entirely without merit. What do you actually want? She asked. I want Kwon Il-sung to finally answer for what he built and then hid, the instructor said. I want the surviving students, the ones whose bodies still carry the cost of that operation, to receive something more than silence. I want the boy's family, if any of them are still alive, to finally know the truth of what happened to him. He paused. And I want to know whether you, the most capable student either of us ever trained, are willing to help me force that accountability, or whether you intend to spend your career protecting the very family responsible for it instead. That's not a fair choice, Yuna said. You're asking me to choose between justice and the family currently in my care, as though those two things have to be opposed. Don't they? No, Yuna said, with a certainty that surprised her even as she said it. Il-sung should account for what he did, publicly, honestly, in whatever way actually helps the people he hurt, rather than simply erasing his own guilt through silence. But that accountability doesn't require violence, and it certainly doesn't require using me as a weapon against a man whose son had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Jae-min inherited everything his father built, the instructor said, including everything his father hid. Inheriting a family's history isn't the same as being responsible for its worst decisions, Yuna said. I know that better than anyone standing in this exact spot right now. I inherited a training program built on someone else's failure too, and I've spent my entire adult life choosing not to repeat it. The instructor studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his controlled expression, an old and complicated respect settling into place despite the disagreement between them. Baek trained you well, he said finally. Better perhaps than she trained herself to forgive her own part in what happened. She spent 26 years trying to make it right, Yuna said. You've spent the same amount of time deciding the only acceptable response was punishment. I don't think either of you has fully figured out what actual accountability looks like, but I know it isn't what you're proposing tonight. Then what would you propose instead? Force him to answer publicly, Yuna said. Not through violence. Through exposure, on terms that protect the people who were actually hurt rather than simply satisfying whatever this has become for you personally. Let Il-sung face the consequences of his own choices honestly, in front of his son, in front of whatever families remain from that operation. That's accountability. What you're describing is something considerably closer to revenge, and I don't believe revenge actually gives anyone the peace you're pretending you're still looking for. For a long moment, the instructor said nothing at all, the weight of her words settling into the space between them. You may be right, he said finally, something like exhaustion entering his voice for the first time. Or you may simply be young enough to still believe accountability and consequence can be separated as cleanly as you're describing. I've lived considerably longer than you, and I've found the distinction blurs more than people like to admit. Behind them, at the edge of the tree line, Jae-min stepped forward, having listened to enough of the conversation to understand exactly what was being decided in front of him. If you want accountability, Jae-min said, you can have it. Publicly, on my terms. With my father standing in front of whatever families remain from what happened here. I'm not going to pretend the wrong isn't real simply because acknowledging it costs my family its reputation. But I'm also not going to let you use violence to force something that honest accountability could accomplish without a single additional person getting hurt. The instructor turned to study him, weighing the offer with the same careful calculation he'd applied to everything else that night. Your father agreed to that? My father doesn't know I'm here yet, Jae-min admitted. But I know him well enough to believe that facing this directly, finally, after 26 years of silence, is something he's actually been waiting for, whether he had the courage to initiate it himself or not. The instructor was quiet for a long time, looking between the two of them, something in his posture finally loosening. The particular tension of a man who had carried a single narrow purpose for decades, suddenly confronted with an alternative he hadn't fully allowed himself to consider. "I'll give you 30 days, he said finally. "A public accounting, on the terms you've described, involving every family affected by what happened here. If it doesn't happen, or if it happens only in the careful, sanitized way powerful families usually manage these things, I won't offer this patience a second time." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Yuna with an expression she couldn't fully read. "For what it's worth," he said, "Baek chose well when she placed you in that house. I don't say that as consolation. I say it because it's true, and because I think some part of her, whatever her reasons, was hoping exactly this outcome might be possible." He disappeared into the tree line, leaving Yuna and Jae-min alone in the cold, quiet dark of a property that had spent 26 years hiding exactly what had happened there. "Do you have any idea how many others there might be?" Yuna asked, once the sound of his footsteps had faded completely, still turning over everything the instructor had told her that night. "Students trained the way I was, placed the way I apparently was, without ever fully understanding why. I've wondered that myself, tonight, listening to him talk," Jae-min admitted. "Watching how carefully you assessed him, how quickly you separated what he wanted from what he actually deserved. I find myself thinking there may be more people like you scattered through this world than any of us realize, quietly doing exactly the kind of work Baek always intended, protecting rather than destroying, without anyone around them ever fully understanding where that instinct came from." "That's either a comforting thought or a deeply unsettling one," Yuna said. "I haven't decided which yet." "Perhaps it can be both," Jae-min said quietly. "I've found, over the last month, that most of the important truths in my life have turned out to be exactly that." 3 weeks later, the accounting happened publicly, exactly as promised, on terms Jae-min and his father negotiated together for the first time in either of their memories as genuine partners, rather than as a patriarch and his careful successor. Il-sung stood before the surviving students and the family of the boy who hadn't survived, and offered an accounting that cost him considerably, financially, publicly, personally, but that Yuna watched settle over the room with something closer to relief than devastation, the particular weight of a truth finally allowed into the open after 26 years of careful, corrosive silence. The two surviving students, both well into their 30s now, spoke briefly, their words measured but unmistakably genuine, describing years spent carrying an injury and a silence neither of them had ever been permitted to name publicly until this exact afternoon. The boy's mother, elderly now, frail in a way that made the room fall unusually quiet when she rose to speak, thanked Il-sung not for the compensation he'd offered, but simply for finally saying her son's name aloud in front of people who had spent decades pretending he never existed at all. Yuna stood near the back of the room throughout, watching Jae-min beside his father, understanding for the first time the particular shape of the trust that had grown between them over the last month, built not on convenience or coincidence, but on the deliberate, difficult choices each of them had made once the truth became impossible to avoid. Afterward, as the room slowly emptied, Jae-min found her near the doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for refusing the version of this that would have ended in more violence. For believing there was a better way through it, even when neither my father nor the instructor seemed capable of finding it themselves." "I didn't do it for you," Yuna said, though there was no coldness in it. "I did it because I believe in the version of the choice Baek always tried to teach me, that restraint isn't weakness, and that justice doesn't require becoming the thing you're trying to hold accountable." "I know," Jae-min said. "That's exactly why I'm thanking you." He hesitated a moment, glancing toward the emptying room before looking back at her directly. "My father asked me this morning whether I intended to extend your contract beyond its original term," he said. "I told him that decision was entirely yours to make, not his, though I'll admit I have my own hope about which way you'll decide." "That's not really a question you're asking me right now, is it?" Yuna said. "No," Jae-min admitted. "I suppose it isn't. I only wanted you to know the offer exists, whenever you're ready to consider it, without any pressure attached to how quickly you answer." Yuna allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at this estate, a small, genuine smile. "I'll think about it," she said, and meant it more sincerely than she'd expected to. That night, back in the small guest suite that had, over the last month, begun to feel considerably less temporary than it once had, Yuna's phone buzzed with a final message, the number unfamiliar once more. She opened it slowly, some old, careful instinct already bracing for whatever came next, though she told herself the worst of it was surely behind her now. The accounting finished, the instructor's 30 days honored ahead of schedule, the estate finally settling into something resembling peace for the first time since she'd arrived. You handled that better than I expected. Better, I think, than I would have, at your age. But there's something Bake never told you, something I only learned myself in these last few weeks of watching you work. You are not the only one she placed. There are others, trained the same way, taught the same restraint, standing right now in households you'd never think to suspect. Ask her how many. Ask her whether she ever told any of them the full truth either, or whether every one of you has been living inside the same careful silence I only just escaped. Yuna read the message twice, the quiet satisfaction of the evening's resolution giving way, slowly, to a new and considerably more unsettling question. She thought of every contract she'd ever accepted through the agency, every placement that had always felt, in hindsight, slightly too convenient to be entirely coincidental, and wondered, for the first time, how many of those assignments had actually come from Bake's careful hand rather than random chance, and how many other students, right now, were sitting somewhere just like this, wondering the exact same thing about their own quiet, carefully arranged lives. She had assumed, all this time, that she was the only one Bake had placed with such deliberate purpose. She was no longer certain that assumption had ever been true, and for the first time since arriving at this estate, she found herself wondering not just who else might be out there, but what any of them would do the day they finally learned the truth for themselves.